Hi, it's great to be with you guys tonight. Well, sort of with you in one way or another. But it's always exciting to be able to bring the Word of God. And so we've just finished a series called You Asked For It, where Pastor Jason walked us through a lot of answers to a lot of questions that you, the congregation, were given the opportunity to ask. Questions about God, about Scripture, about the faith life. It was a very wide open range of availability, and you guys asked some fantastic questions, some deep and difficult ones, and it's been a great series. And last week, Pastor Jason closed out the series by talking about the idea of judging, and I'm going to kind of pick up from there and go a little further, sort of ish. You'll figure out as we go along, but. If you missed last week's message, I want to encourage you to go online and check it out. You can find it on our church website. It's a great message, absolutely worth hunting down and finding. So check it out. Anyway, so tonight I'm picking up and kind of moving forward a little bit. This technically isn't something that was asked by anyone, which is why it's not technically in the You Asked For It series. But it is, in truth, it's a question that many people are asking, or this kind of question, or thoughts and opinions along the spectrum of where this question kind of goes. Questions like it, or living with assumptions or judgments where maybe they should be asking the question and seeking some kind of an answer. Essentially, the question is about today's youth. Today's teens are a generation that quite frankly, they're a generation that has been given up on before they've really even hardly had a chance to get started. And I've heard the questions both inside and outside the church, and they're not too different. They're questions like, what do we do about today's youth? Or statements like, well, you're a youth pastor. You tell me why I should have any faith in today's teenagers. Or statements like, it's hard to feel very encouraged about today's youth and what they're going to make of our world. And to be completely honest, the questions come from a lot of articles, a lot of studies, a lot of news cycles that constantly keep in front of us some of the worst of their generation. The reality is it's some of the worst of all of our generations. So when it comes to today's teens, even though they're typically seen as multitasking wizards, the ability to pay attention to social media on multiple various digital platforms while doing homework in front of the TV and seeming to accomplish things in all three of those areas, trust me, I've seen it happen. My kids are this generation, and it blows my mind. And even though multitasking is not really a healthy thing for the still developing adolescent mind, but we're not going to go into that. I've got enough to geek out on with generational theory, so I don't need to go into adolescent neuropsychology. But though they may be multitasking wizards, they have a reputation amongst the generations above them as being lazy, apathetic, unaware, aloof, or clueless about reality. They've been labeled the me generation, although the me generation really is more the millennial generation, that depending upon who you read and what generational theory you might come across or subscribe to, the me generation is either fully graduated or still has a few years of graduates left. But they're a generation that isn't likely to call each other and say, hey, you want to go for a run? They're more likely to call and say, hey, want to come over and play Call of Duty? They're obese. They aren't motivated to get up and do anything. These are a lot of the stereotypical descriptions. And all of this is pretty true as far as a generational stereotype. Childhood obesity is off the charts. Childhood diabetes is out of control. And a lot of it comes from living a sedentary lifestyle coupled with poor eating habits. And those are the realities of the stereotype. Another reality is, on the church side of things, some church stats, one in particular, there is this thing called post-graduation exodus. It's the mass exodus of teenagers that leave the church once they graduate. And the current statistics show that they are leaving the church after they graduate at a rate of around 70%, which is alarming. And the reality is it's kind of different for different churches. Larger churches will tend to be on the higher end, sometimes even higher than 70%, and smaller churches will tend to be on the lower end, even much lower than 70%. These statistics really come into place with mid-sized to larger churches. But it's the reality that has so much of the older generations of the church in despair. They graduate and they walk away. The upside is 60% of those that walk away tend to come back later as adults with families. And so these are statistics that are based on things that have happened, not necessarily exactly right now, but the reality is what we're seeing is either the same or a little worse that's happening with today's current generation. And it's a scary statistic, but it fits in with the stereotype. And that's a word that we love to use. It's a word that we love to involve ourselves with, stereotype. We love to draw general conclusions about vast segments of population based on trends that though they may apply to many, sometimes even most, they rarely apply to all of that particular segment of population. And let's be honest, some of the stats that we're talking about, our kids are obese because so many of us are obese and we're teaching them how to be that. Our kids have poor eating habits because of what we allow them to eat. Our kids have digital devices that didn't suddenly just appear in their hands. Somebody had to put them there. We bought them for them, and we pay the expenses for their data packages. But this isn't really about how they got there or whose fault any of it is. This is about them. And the reality is they also bring a lot of really great things to the table. But in reality, doing youth ministry for almost 3 decades now, I've seen a great deal of many of those characteristics in past generations of teens. I remember being some of those things as a teen, and if some of you are really honest about seeking accurate memories, not remembering your greatest strengths, but really being honest with some of your maybe more negative memories, some of you remember being some of those things as well. But in all of my years of working with teens, there is one thing that I honestly believe is undisputable. One thing that I can tell you with full confidence that absolutely has changed. It's not a good change. It's a discouraging change. It's a trait that brings great pain to my heart. This generation of teens, more than any generation before them that I've seen, is coming into their teen years already with more hurt, with more brokenness, with more tragedy in their lives than any kid should have to face. It's a generation that has never known life without the internet, but they've also never known life without the imminent threat of acts of terror. It's a generation that has their hands full of digital platforms, allowing them to connect with each other faster than any other generation before, but this connection turns out to be a false reality that in the end leaves them feeling more disconnected from real people and real relationship than any generation before them. It's a generation where broken homes or dysfunctional homes are more normal than not. They've been abandoned, they've been abused, many have given up on the chance of having a normal, healthy, functioning life. Many of them don't even know that there is an alternative to the broken life because all they know is woundedness and brokenness. That's all they've experienced, and it's all they see in so many of their friends around them. On the opposite side of the spectrum, some teens are even overprotected to the point where they don't know how to make basic decisions on their own. And it all speaks into some of the aloofness, some of the confusion, some of the difficulty of teens to function in reality. And that's one of the most important and sobering pieces of this reality. There is this depth of brokenness, of uselessness, of worthlessness, this feeling of inadequacy and how they feel that I have not seen in almost 3 decades of working with teenagers. Even our healthy, functioning teens deal with hurt and brokenness that we can't fathom because it's all around them. They live in a youth culture that's driven by wounded peers. Their peers are wounded. And the reality is, let's face the reality, wounded people wound people. And so they live in a culture of wounded peers that out of their woundedness wound others. And sometimes it's our healthy kids that get wounded. Sometimes it's other wounded kids, and there's this cycle that kicks in of wounded, further wounding the wounded, and those further wounded wound even further the wounded, and it gets out of control. So in reality, if we're going to put any kind of label, if we're going to put any kind of generational stereotype, if we're going to put any kind of label on this generation, let's at least be honest about it. The reality is they are the wounded generation. And Jesus dealt with wounded people really, really well. In fact, there's a story in John chapter 4. You can begin to turn there. Pastor Jason even referred to this story last week where Jesus dealt with a woman who was broken and lost. John chapter 4. I'll give you a second. So, Jesus discovered that the Pharisees were starting to get a little freaked out because they're discovering that Jesus is baptizing more people than John. The reality was the disciples, but to them it's Jesus. And so Jesus begins to head from Judea back to Galilee. And in order to get there, he's got to go through Samaria. And so while in Samaria, he comes across this woman. We're going to pick up in verse 7. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, so Jesus was at a well. When a woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy some food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." And Jesus answered her, If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well, and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and his herds?" And Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water that I will give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." In verse 15, the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." Jesus' awesome little tactic to get to the dialogue where he really wanted to talk about. In verse 17, she said, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You're right. And when you say you have no husband, the fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're now with is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." The woman said, "I can see that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." And Jesus declared, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and is now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship him in spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming, and when he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I who speak to you am he." This woman was broken. Husband after husband after husband after husband after husband, and the guy she's with now in this relationship, this sinful relationship, is not her husband. She's broken. This is a sure sign of woundedness and lostness. And part of our problem is that we see symptoms of woundedness, and rather than move to compassion, we see it as a label. We see it as a characteristic. We see it as a problem. We judge it as sin, as if we don't have sin in our own lives, or aren't sinners. Or we put on it whatever other label we want to place on someone. And the reality is that these traits that we like to judge so much are signs of someone who isn't healthy. They're signs of someone being broken. They're signs of someone who's hurting. And this woman is hurting, and Jesus took the time to speak to her, which was risky. Why was it risky? It was risky because she's a Samaritan, and they didn't interact. She's a woman, and she's been married a whole bunch of times, and she's currently in a relationship she shouldn't be in. And yet Jesus takes the time to sit down with her and talk. They even talked about spiritual things. Jesus saw the brokenness in her and the fact that she's marginalized. She's on the outside of her society. He sees this, yet he takes the time to make her feel loved, to make her feel valued. He spoke about the sin. He spoke against it. He identified it. He called it what it was. He didn't make excuses about it. He didn't let her off the hook with the sin. He called sin sin, and he told her to stop doing it. But he spoke love into her life. He spoke acceptance into her life. Now, many of you, like me, may have experiences with something that's relatively common. It's something that comes up at Thanksgiving, and maybe again at Christmas, maybe the occasional large family gathering outside of those holidays. This cultural phenomena, this thing, this issue is the infamous kids table. Now, when I was a kid, we really didn't have a kids table. My cousins and family lived far enough away that we really didn't have massive family gatherings when I was a kid. It was my family, my mom and dad, and my two sisters and I, and my grandparents on both sides lived nearby, and so they would often come to the family gatherings, but we were usually able to add another table right to the end of the main table, and it was all together. I guess our version of a kids table would be that the substandard added on length of table was maybe where the kids sat. But I really don't have big memories of a kids table growing up. The big issue for me, not being the kids table, the big issue was for me personally was the table leg. I don't know if any of you have experience with the table leg, but everyone else in the family got a chair in prime real estate. I mean, primo space. There was open space, legs could be free, feet could move around. There was plenty of room for their legs except me. And it wasn't long before I even had the longest legs in the family, yet as the youngest and out of habit, I still got placed at the table leg, the corner, the place where you had to wrestle in just to fit into the provided space, and once you're there, you're locked in. A little later, more family gathered around and a kid table appeared more and more, but it was still pretty much a rare thing. But as my sisters got married and they started having kids, and suddenly the kids table became a relatively regular thing. But as the youngest of my siblings, there were occasional times when there still wasn't quite enough room for all of the adults at the kids table. So there were times where, as an adult, I found myself at the kids table. In fact, it still happens from time to time. I'm 47 years old. I'm not a small man. And just a handful of years ago at my parents' house for Thanksgiving, there was such a large crowd that I got put at the kids' table. I was late 30s. I think it was more in my early 40s, but it was somewhere in that range. And I'm sitting at the kids' table, which was an old-fashioned card table. So it was flimsy, it was small, and it was low. And it was way too low for my long legs. And so during the meal, my knees kept hitting the table and constantly jarring the table and shaking beverages and spilling mine or somebody else's or everybody's, depending on how bad it was. But when you're a kid, or a 40-year-old grown man sitting at the kids' table, all you want, all you look forward to is sitting at the other table, sitting at the grown-up table. You long for the day where you have a seat at the table with all of the adults. And that's at the heart of what teens want. They want a seat at the table. They want a seat at someone's table somewhere. There's a generation of teens out there looking for tables where they might be welcome. And so a question to ask is, are they welcome at yours? I mean, they come messy, they come broken, they come with some difficult baggage, they come with some generational characteristics that we frown upon, forgetting that our own generational characteristics weren't so great. They come to us with a longing to find a place that will give them a seat at a table. Jesus took the time to give the woman at the well a seat at his table. And obviously, we're not talking about a dining table filled with food where family is gathering. We're talking about a willingness within ourselves, a willingness within our hearts to set aside judgments, to set aside stereotypes, race, religion, sexuality, and so many other factors, and to simply show love. Is your table receiving guests? That's a question to ask. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is the truest sense of what it means to show hospitality. Is your table receiving guests? You know, when you look at a wounded life, are you pessimistic or are you moved by love? To love. Are you moved not just by love, but are you moved by love, to act? So while it's true that wounded people wound people, it's also true that healed people heal people. And Jesus gives this touch of healing to this woman at the well, and he tells her to stop sinning. He calls the sin what it is, but he gives her this love. He gives her this healing salve to put on the woundedness that is so embedded in her life. It's caused her to live in this cycle. She's acted out of the woundedness of her life. And we do that too. Our culture is filled with people who do that, not just teenagers. We act out of our woundedness, and when we have wounds that go untreated, they fester and they get infected, and they cause us to act in ways that are a result of that wound. The reality is so much of our behavior in our adult lives comes from the fact that we were wounded, comes from the nature of specific wounds that we received years ago. Sometimes many, many years ago. So what does this woman do? When Jesus comes to her, he calls her sin, tells her to stop doing it, but he treats her with respect and love and acceptance and says, you have a place at my table. And he shows her love and acceptance. What does she do? She starts running around spreading the good news. She starts spreading some of the healing salve that she received from Jesus. We pick it up here in chapter 4, verse 28. Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to town and said to the people, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ? And they came out of the town and made their way toward him. Jumping to verse 39, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days, and because of his words, many more became believers. And they said to the woman, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. When we can get beyond some of the stereotypes that we put on other people, or even degrees of sin that we create that Jesus doesn't necessarily recognize, and we're willing to receive wounded people at our tables, we're given the opportunity to provide a healing that only Christ can provide. Oh, and by the way, those church statistics of the post-graduation exodus of teenagers, of 70% of teens leave the church after graduation. There are part of those same studies reveal some of the ways to deal with that. And what they found is that when teenagers, during their teen years, when they work with, when they are able to serve in the church, serve the body, specifically serve children in the church, that 70% statistic drops significantly. Add to that the fact that when adults will come in and work alongside them, not just leave the work to them, not just come in and work over them and they're the underlings, but work with them as a peer, work with them not as a kid at a kid's table, but work with them like they are at the adult grown-up table. They'll partner with them in ministry and work alongside them. That statistic will drop even more. It's the specific reason why we have our teens emphasized on Sunday mornings to volunteer, to get involved, to serve the body. And we emphasize the children's department. And we have them in the nursery. They're in with the elementary age. They're in with toddler. We have them. We encourage them. We empower them to serve in the church. What we need more of is adults to come into the children's department and work alongside them, partner with them, not rule over them, but to work with them, to keep those statistics dropping and dropping and dropping. So we come back to that question, what do we do with today's youth? We love them. We work alongside them. They have a great deal to offer. They have survival skills on a level that we've never seen. Despite their woundedness, they possess a level of optimism that says, if I can just get a seat at a table somewhere, any table, anywhere, I'm going to work to make this a better world. And despite their brokenness, they possess this great capacity to hope. They just need some place, somewhere that will believe in them. That's why I'm 47 years old and I'm still in youth ministry, because I believe in them and my heart breaks for them and their woundedness. And I want them to know that they have a place at the table. They're not the church of tomorrow. I hate that. I've hated that for years. We've got to stop calling them the church of tomorrow. They are the church today. They're not at the kids' table. They are at the grown-up table. We need to let them be at the grown-up table. They're the church of today. And this means that if we can open up some of the seats at our tables and show them this healing that only Jesus provides, that they'll be healed people. There'll be people that are healed by Jesus that will seek to make the world a better place by the power of Jesus. They're a generation that wants to rise up and take their place. They just need to know where their place is. They need to know that they have a place. Is the church the place for them? So let's show them. Hopefully the worship team is coming. If they're not, come now. We need to show them. Let's give them a seat at the table, but not the kids' table, and not at the corner. Let's not give them menial jobs. We have kids on our worship teams. We have teens that are singing, that are playing instruments. They're key parts of these teams. We have teens that are running visuals for our services. We have teens that are serving children in the nursery. We have teens that are serving toddlers. We have teens that are serving elementary age kids. We have teens that serve in just about any opportunity that they have to serve the community. Just about any service thing we throw out there, we have teens that flood to it. They serve. We have teens serving. But there's still a generation of teenagers out there that don't know, that wonder if there's a place for them. And rather than look at their lifestyle and look at the decisions that they've made and the choices that they make and the things that they involve themselves in and maybe the way that they act in their youth, rather than look at those things and judge them as bad kids. And frankly, beyond the teenagers, there's a world of people out there that act and do and say things that we judge all the time. And rather than put them in stereotypical labels and classifications, let's open the doors. Get out there with them. Jesus went to the well that the woman was going to come to. He didn't go somewhere in hopes that the woman would be done with the well and then come to wherever he might be. He went where she was going to be. Let's go where they are. Go into their lives and show them that they've got a place at the table, and it's not the kids' table. These teens have contributions to make right here, right now. I see it in their eyes every week. I hear it in their voices. They long to make a difference. So let's be a Christ difference in them and give them a seat at the table.